It is really nice to see a lot of familiar names and faces, and I am really excited to dive in with you today. I have a lot of content and also want to save time for questions, so I'm going to go ahead and just dive right in and talk to you about our 2024 state budget in Pennsylvania. We're going to touch on early literacy, we'll touch on school funding, as well as some other key education issues. And hopefully you'll come away with a better understanding of how what happens in Harrisburg is affecting students and teachers here in Philadelphia and ways that you can get involved. A little bit about me. I am a former high school English and history teacher. I got my start teaching in the school district of Philadelphia at West Philadelphia High School, and also taught in at Simon Gratz Mastery Charter in North Philadelphia before becoming a principal in Camden, New Jersey, with both the Camden City School District as well as Uncommon Schools. I have had the opportunity and the privilege to work with students from grades K through 12 over the course of my time as a teacher and a leader, and I really do bring that experience with me in my work now in the policy and advocacy space. I'm also the mom of 2 boys, one of whom will start kindergarten in the school district of Philadelphia next year, and so have always felt like this work is very personal, but obviously I've got that additional stake in having a really thriving school system as Julian prepares for kindergarten. A little bit about Teach Plus, and I'm going to, before I dive into the policy weeds, I'm going to share with you just a little bit about how Teach Plus is thinking about policy, strategy, and some of the different drivers we see as really being important in terms of advancing opportunity for students. So we are a national nonprofit. Teach Plus Pennsylvania is one of 11 regions in the national nonprofit. Our mission is to empower excellent, experienced, and diverse teachers to take leadership over key policy and practice issues that advance equity, opportunity, and student success. We believe that all students should have the opportunity to achieve their potential in an education system defined by its commitment to equity, its responsiveness to individual needs, and its ability to prepare students for post-secondary success. And we believe that teachers are an often untapped lever in helping to create such an education system. A little bit about where we operate and what kinds of things we do across the Commonwealth. In the policy space, we lead a Teaching Policy Fellowship, which is a statewide cohort of 45 educators from district and charter schools, as well as the early childhood education space, who learn about education policy and work to advance policy change in key areas, many of which we'll be talking about today. We also have several different instructional practice and other kinds of practice programs, a program in Philadelphia called the Philadelphia Affinity Group Network, which focuses on teachers of color, creating supportive spaces to help with retention of teachers of color. A program with Independence Mission Schools focused on teacher-led professional learning around early literacy. And then a program out in Pittsburgh called Equity Leadership Institute, where we bring together teachers and administrators to help develop plans to diversify their educator workforces. We have a Pennsylvania Teacher Network that is open to all former, prospective, current educators in Pennsylvania who are interested in learning about both policy and practice, and we hold monthly network events. And then, as you can see, we also do a lot of coalition work in the policy space, and you'll hear more about some of those topics today. And so just a little bit, again, this is, I want to be transparent about the way that Teach Plus and I personally think about educational progress, name some of the assumptions that we're making, because you'll see that those inform the ways I'm talking about what was a win and what was a loss in this most recent state budget. You might not share all of these assumptions, but you'll know where I'm coming from and sort of what our theory of change is as an organization. We have been recently engaging in a strategic clarity process as we think about the kind of impact that we as Teach Plus want to have over the next decade. And one of the first things that we did was to name the progress that we need. We wanted to understand how students and families across Pennsylvania defined opportunity and success for themselves, and what role they saw schools playing in helping students to achieve their wildest aspirations. And so last year, our teachers held over 50 focus groups with students and parents across Pennsylvania. And what we found was that overwhelmingly, regardless of race or place, class, politics, geography, parents and students have big and really multifaceted dreams for students' futures that can't be reduced to just a single thing. Those passions include, or those aspirations include students pursuing passions, obtaining financial stability and generational wealth, changing their communities, and becoming independent, happy, psychologically strong, and fulfilled in their careers. So for my focus group, I chose to speak to some former students of mine from West and North Philadelphia who are now parents themselves. So one of my former students, who you'll see in the top picture, Calvin, and he did give me permission to share this with you all. I taught him in an underfunded high school in North Philadelphia. He's now a father to two young boys that you can see here. And he told me about how inquisitive and perceptive and caring his children are, and his dreams for his kids. So he said, I just want them to be happy doing whatever they want, whether that's being a teacher or being a doctor or being a police officer. Whatever it is, as long as they're able to maximize their full potential. I don't want them to do something just as a job. I want them to do what they're passionate about and be successful at that. And I want society to see them as respectable, helpful, caring to others, and having empathy for others. I was really struck by Calvin's response, not only because I was so proud of the great father he's become, but also because his aspirations for his children are so similar to the ones I have for my two sons, who are about the same age as his two sons. And we also found that parents expect that public schools will be the vehicles that allow children to achieve these dreams. Parents and students have really high expectations for their public schools. They take it as a given that schools must teach those foundational academic skills and allow their kids to read on grade level. And they also want schools to be teaching higher order thinking skills and more practical skills for success as adults. I share all of that because there's a huge disconnect between the aspirations of communities and current student outcomes, especially in underserved communities. People often think about Pennsylvania as being average or slightly above average nationally, in terms of academic outcomes, as well as in things like school funding. But I always remind people that these averages mask some of the largest racial and socioeconomic opportunity gaps and achievement gaps in the country. We know, and as Read by Fourth, I know you all know, that the ability to read on grade level by the end of third grade or the beginning of fourth grade is probably the most predictive academic outcome of any metric that's been researched. If you're reading on grade level, at that point, you're exponentially more likely to graduate from high school, to get a well-paying job, to avoid incarceration, and even to live longer. And we also heard from our parents in these focus groups that it's not the only measure of success that matters, but it's one very straightforward measure of whether our schools are working is the answer to the question, can my child read? So it's a prerequisite for all these other dreams that parents have for themselves, for their children. And so what you'll see in these little diagrams here is that in an average Pennsylvania fourth grade classroom of 20 students, this is according to the nation's report card, also known as the National Assessment of Educational Progress, only 6 students will be able to read proficiently. That's 34%. In a classroom that's made up entirely of all Black students, as we see in many segregated schools in Philadelphia, it would be only 2, 11%. In an all Hispanic class, it would be 4, 20%. And in a classroom of all economically disadvantaged students, only 4, 18% would read on grade level. I don't have the diagram here for Philadelphia, but we do have Philadelphia specific data because Philadelphia participates in something called the TUDA that allows us to get city specific data. And so for Philadelphia as a whole, this would be only 3 students out of the class of 20 reading proficiently, and as low as 1 to 2 students per class for Black, Hispanic, and low-income students. So there's just no way to look at how our students are doing at maybe this most foundational academic skill, particularly in our underserved communities, and say that our public schools are currently living up to the high expectations our communities have for them as the vehicles for children to achieve their dreams. And then we see these same racial and socioeconomic inequities that are showing up in the classroom being perpetuated across our entire society. So this is what keeps us up at night. It's easy to feel hopeless looking at this huge gulf between families' aspirations and our current reality. But Brian Stevenson says that hopelessness is the enemy of justice. And so we choose to not only remain hopeful, but to set big goals about the kind of change we're pursuing over the next 10 years. We envision a Pennsylvania in which all students have the opportunity to fulfill their potential. And specifically, we seek to make Pennsylvania the fastest improving state in the country in fourth grade reading, matching the rate of Mississippi, which has been the fastest improving state in the country over the past decade. We seek to make Philadelphia the fastest improving urban district in the country. You've heard our superintendent speak about that. specifically matching the gains of Washington, D.C., which has been the fastest improving urban district over the past 10 years. And during this time, we expect to see achievement gaps narrow. So we should see more improvement for Black, Hispanic, special education students, and economically disadvantaged students than the overall average gains. We know that achieving this goal won't magically make everything perfect in our public education system, but we do believe that it would be a huge shift from where we are right now. So I won't speak about these strategic drivers in a lot of detail, but again, this is just informing the way that we think about the policy landscape. These are some of the major ways in which Teach Plus is seeking to achieve these strategic goals. First of all, we know that across all of these different domains, we need political will and we need leadership alignment in order to make early literacy progress a priority and to ensure that we are making progress on some of our different drivers that are going to help us to achieve that. So we work to engage senior leaders, the governor, the mayor, the superintendent, others who are in positions of power to embrace these strategic goals and policy priorities, and to build strong and diverse coalitions to help to build political will. And then additionally, I won't focus too much on this first one right now, but we are trying to think about how can Teach Plus and others support key school districts such as the School District of Philadelphia to accelerate their achievement in early literacy. And then how do we improve early literacy state policy, equitable funding at the state level, and eliminating the teacher shortage and strengthening our teacher workforce. So we'll talk about some of these different policy drivers as we take a look at the state budget. I will say a little bit about each of these kind of policy categories as we go, about why we believe they are drivers that are going to have an ultimate impact on early literacy achievement. So the state budget, at a high level, there was some good, there was some bad. There wasn't too much that was really, truly ugly, but we'll talk about all of it today. Starting with school funding. So we know that research has told us that equitable and adequate funding is a key driver that impacts student achievement. We can see very clearly, both nationally and in Pennsylvania, that when students, regardless of their background, are in schools that are adequately resourced, they get better outcomes. And it makes sense because that means if schools have additional resources, they can hire qualified teachers, they can reduce class sizes, they can put into place all of these different conditions that impact learning. We also know that we currently have an inadequate and inequitable system, that the kids who need the most get the least because of where they live. Research tells us that all children can achieve, all children can reach academic standards, state standards, but some children, based on their backgrounds and based on some of the challenges they're facing, need additional resources in order to meet those resources. Our system currently is the exact opposite. Many of those students who are living in poverty, who are facing challenges due to disability, are in districts where they receive less funding than their more affluent peers. So the Commonwealth Court ruled in 2023 that our system is unconstitutional because it, number one, violates our education clause of the Pennsylvania State Constitution, which guarantees a thorough and efficient system of public education. And number two, because it violates the Equal Protection Clause. It specifically, she said, it discriminates against students in low wealth districts because the state doesn't do its job in adequately providing enough. And the local districts that do not have a lot of local wealth, they can't keep up with those more affluent districts who can raise more revenue locally. And so the Basic Education Funding Commission was established or charged with fixing our school funding system. This is a legislative body that met in the fall of 2024, held a series of hearings across the state to hear what was proposed and what could be done to make our system more equitable and basically to meet constitutional muster. So what was proposed in last year's budget? After the Basic Education Funding Commission issued its report in January of 2024, Governor Shapiro proposed a year one investment in line with that report. So he made his budget proposal in February, and he proposed $1.8 billion in new education funding. This was, again, based on the first year recommendation of the Basic Education Funding Commission, which had said that we have a $5.1 billion total adequacy gap. $5.1 billion more is needed from the state in order to ensure that all students, regardless of where they live, have equitable learning opportunities. After Governor Shapiro proposed this one-year investment, he did not make a multi-year commitment. He just said, this is how much we should put in year one. And it was in line with what the Basic Education Commission said should be year one of a 7-year plan. The House then passed a bill called House Bill 2370 that codified the governor's year one numbers, but it went a step further. And it said, we're actually committing ourselves to a timeline that we're going to continue these investments at the same level for 7 years until the full $5.1 billion adequacy gap is closed. And that bill passed in the Pennsylvania House in June of 2024. It was sponsored by the entire House Democratic leadership team, and it passed with unanimous Democratic support and the support of a handful of House Republicans. It did not go anywhere in the Senate, but it was at the table for budget negotiations, which take place in June. The state budget is supposed to be done by June 30th of each year. It gets later and later. This year it got completed about 2 weeks late. So what actually ended up happening with school funding? First, during negotiations, legislative leaders made a technical change to how they calculated adequacy to bring the total adequacy gap from $5.1 billion to $4.5 billion. We won't go into all the details. It has to do with what metric you use to measure poverty in schools. I believe it was a cynical ploy to just lower the price tag in terms of what they needed to pay, but they brought that number down to $4.5 billion. The legislature did write into the language that goes along with the budget the calculation of how you get to $4.5 billion. So they explicitly made adequate funding an express goal, and they agreed on a way to quantify the total need. Even though it was a little smaller than advocates had called for, the General Assembly has essentially at this point said, we agree that $4.5 billion is needed in order to bring all schools up to adequacy. And the amount that was invested really moved underfunded districts to the front of the line. Historically, the General Assembly has prioritized kind of incremental increases to all 500 districts over any type of large investments in the most high-need districts. This was sort of a sea change in that the majority of new education funding went towards these adequacy payments to underfunded districts. The total amount was around $500 million. So less than what Governor Shapiro had proposed. It was only about 1/9 of the total adequacy gap that the legislature proposed. And there was no timeline or long-term commitment that the General Assembly agreed to in the final budget. They have not said publicly in any way, yes, we're actually on the hook for closing this full adequacy gap. They've calculated it, they've made it clear that it exists, but they've only put 1 year of funding into it so far. There were other additional increases, so the overall education spending increased by about $1 billion. What does this mean for Philadelphia? For each of these topics, I'm going to try to give you a little bit of information specifically about the impact on Philadelphia. Philadelphia is the largest school district in the Commonwealth. It also has a very large adequacy gap. A lot of students who qualify for additional funding based on poverty, based on special education status, and so forth. So Philadelphia this year is receiving $232 million in increased funding. That's an increase of over 10% in total state funding. If we continue to see these increases on a year-over-year basis over the next 5 to 7 years, we're going to get close to a point of almost double the amount of state funding that we previously received by the end of this time. So this really could be, monumental for Philadelphia and really change what's possible for both district schools and charter schools in Philadelphia, because this is something that where kind of a rising tide does lift all boats. So it's progress. It's still not everything that's owed, but we do see that this is already going to mean opportunities to offer additional programming in Philadelphia, to start to address some of the glaring facilities needs that we know exist, to hire additional teachers and so forth. Okay, I'm going to keep on moving for the sake of time. I know I'm giving you a lot. Let's talk a little bit about early literacy policy. So we know that obviously one of the things that impacts students' early literacy outcomes is how well they're taught to read. There is a very established body of knowledge called the science of reading that I know many of you are familiar with, that aligns with how our brains learn to read, and addresses the fact that reading for our brains is not a natural process in the way that learning to speak is, and so that we actually have to rewire our brains in order to be able to translate that verbal language that we have evolved, we're hardwired to pick up, to actually translate that into the written code. So many Pennsylvania teachers have never been trained in the science of reading, or structured literacy as it's also called. And in fact, many have been trained in a non-evidence-based approach called balanced literacy, where they are teaching children techniques that can actually be counterproductive to really learning to be a proficient reader. Techniques like guessing, looking at pictures to try to figure out words rather than really attending to the code itself. Likewise, many Pennsylvania schools are using curricular materials, instructional materials that are not evidence-based or aligned with the science of reading. So even if a teacher has been trained in the science of reading, they might be instructed by their district to use materials, probably the best known is Lucy Calkins' units of study, as an approach where they're being told to use materials that encourage guessing, that encourage balanced literacy approaches. And so as a result, many of our students are not receiving evidence-based literacy instruction. And in addition, many schools and districts are not doing any kind of universal screening or early intervention. And many struggling readers in Pennsylvania aren't identified or receiving support until they reach third grade, which we know is this key benchmark where they already should have received that foundational support and they're expected to be transitioning from learning to read to reading to learn. So there's a great need. And many states across the country are up to 10 to 12 years ahead of Pennsylvania in terms of making sure that the science of reading has been incorporated into teacher training and into instructional materials. So in Pennsylvania, what was proposed in this most recent budget year was a set of companion bills in the Senate and the House, Senate Bill 801 and House Bill 998, that would require districts to adopt instructional materials and universal screeners aligned with the science of reading. It would provide funding for teacher training and curriculum purchases, and it would require schools to start with early identification as early as kindergarten, and then provide intervention for those struggling readers. Many of these policy ideas are based on those that have been extremely successful in states like Mississippi and Florida in really accelerating literacy achievement. So the good news is Senate Bill 801 passed the Pennsylvania Senate. It was almost unanimous. Only one person voted against it, and I'm still a little salty about that. I'm still working on that one senator, but it passed almost unanimously. It seemed like it was on sort of a glide path to become adopted as part of the final budget process. Unfortunately, the result is it did not get included in the final budget. And we won't go into a lot of details here. The reasons have a lot to do with politics and sort of inter-caucus dynamics, more so than any actual objections to the bill. I think that the reality is, even though it was supported by many, it was not prioritized by the key leaders that we need to see prioritize it. So that goes back to that political will and leadership alignment driver that we talked about at the beginning, is that it's not enough in Harrisburg, unfortunately, for people to think something's a good idea if they don't see this as something that's their priority, that they are a champion of, and that they're willing to fight for it and potentially put something else off to the side in order to prioritize it for funding. It still might not make it across the finish line. So we will be working very hard in the upcoming budget to ensure that this funding and this policy is passed. We are excited to be launching soon a more formalized early literacy statewide coalition that's really going to be focusing on policy, and we will stay tuned for more on that. A little bit about Philadelphia. Fortunately, the School District of Philadelphia is not waiting for legislation before moving forward with the science of reading. They have taken steps under Dr. Watlington to adopt evidence-based, high-quality instructional materials, and many charter schools in Philadelphia have also been taking steps in this direction. In the school district, EL Education, which is a high-quality program aligned with the science of reading, is being rolled out in grades K to 8 in Philadelphia district schools this current year. It's too early, I would say, for us to be able to comment much on like how successful the rollout is. having supported this curriculum in other networks, I can say it is very dense, and it is going to be extremely important to make sure that there is really high quality ongoing professional learning for teachers. But it is exciting to see that Philadelphia is ahead of the curve and moving forward with these materials, even while we wait for the rest of the state to catch up. And finally, I want to talk a little bit about the educator workforce, why we see that as a key driver and what's going on there. So the research is very clear that the most important in-school factor that impacts student achievement and learning is the quality of the educator workforce. Having access to well-prepared, diverse, highly qualified teachers is extremely predictive of student achievement. Unfortunately, as you probably are aware, we in Pennsylvania are facing a teacher shortage crisis. Teacher certifications are down by 2/3 over the past decade. Pennsylvania used to certify about 20,000 teachers a year. We were a net exporter of teachers. We would send teachers to other states because we were producing more new teachers than we had open jobs. Now we are producing about 6,000 teachers per year, and we are also near all-time highs in terms of teacher turnover. We estimate that we need an additional 15,000 qualified teachers if you take into account vacancies. There's over 2,000 vacancies across the state. Emergency certified teachers, so these are uncertified teachers who are being put into positions because the districts could not find fully certified teachers. There's about 8,500 of those across the state. And then also taking into account teacher turnover, we are estimating we need 15,000 additional qualified teachers. And the shortage is particularly severe for certain subjects, especially special education, STEM subjects, English language, and also we have an acute shortage of teachers of color in Pennsylvania. Only 6% of our educator workforce is people of color. That's compared to 38% of our student body is students of color. Unfortunately, you can see on this map that Philadelphia is in the red here in terms of the extremity of the teacher shortage in the area. On almost every measure, Philadelphia is experiencing this shortage in a more extreme way than any other part of the Commonwealth. We have the highest number and percentage of teacher vacancies. We have the highest number and percentage of teachers on emergency permits. We have the highest teacher attrition rates in the Commonwealth, and those are particularly high, again, for teachers of color. And so this is a really pressing issue for the entire Commonwealth, but even more acutely for Philadelphia. So what was proposed in this year's budget? The first thing that was proposed was full funding of a new program that started the previous year called the Student Teacher Stipend Program. This is a new program that we worked on extensively to address financial barriers to becoming a teacher. One of some key root causes that are making teaching less attractive is the fact that college continues to get more expensive in Pennsylvania, while the financial compensation for teachers has not really changed over the last several decades. And so this proposed program offers $10,000 stipends for student teachers who commit to teach in Pennsylvania. The program was established in 2023 with $10 million initially. We were pushing for full funding of the student teacher stipend program, which is closer to, the estimates vary a little bit, but in the $45 to $50 million range. We were also pushing for $10 million for Grow Your Own programs. This is an innovative way of preparing teachers from the actual community. Oftentimes you target high school students or paraprofessionals as a target population to help them to become teachers within their community through low cost, high quality pathways. And there was also $10 million was proposed by Governor Shapiro. He proposed $10 million in his budget proposal in February. Finally, Senate Republicans proposed a package called Grow PA. This was a higher education package that was proposed in sort of like as an alternative to Governor Shapiro's higher education plan. And one component of this package was teacher scholarships. And so that was another proposal on the table as budget negotiation season kicked off in Harrisburg. So we have more good news on the educator workforce side than we do on the early literacy side, although still a long ways to go. We didn't get all the way to full funding for student teacher stipends, but the funding was doubled compared to the previous year, $20 million in 2024, which is added to the $10 million from the year before. So about 2/3 of the total cost of the program was funded in its first year of implementation. And that money is actually just starting to go out to student teachers this week. And so we are going to see those student teachers for the first time start to receive compensation. Unfortunately, there are some student teachers who are not going to receive that because the program's not fully funded. And so we're excited that the governor has already committed that he is going to work to full funding in next year's budget. The Grow PA package that I mentioned also passed. And so this is something that almost nobody I've talked to has even heard about. I don't think schools of education know about it yet necessarily. And so please help spread the word about this. This is a $5,000 scholarship per year for Pennsylvania college students who study high need subjects, and education is specifically named as one of those subjects, and then work in those fields. So for every year they get a scholarship, they commit to work in education in Pennsylvania for a year. And there is also an opportunity for out-of-state students to receive in-state tuition if they do the same thing. So it doesn't make college free, but that is a significant, up to $20,000 total for Pennsylvania college students. That's a significant amount off of the cost of college that can be used to really entice people into the field of education and get them to stay. So please spread the word. And if you've got high schoolers who are starting to think about college, make sure they know about this new Grow Pennsylvania package that is going into effect. Unfortunately, the Grow Your Own funding did not make it into the final budget. Looking back, I don't think we had a really clear champion who was making this their top priority. So similar to the literacy bill, nobody really opposed it. Everybody liked it, but it got chopped when they needed to find things to chop during negotiations. One unexpected win was that non-citizens can become, for the first time in Pennsylvania, certified to teach. This is another barrier that existed that Teach Plus has been working on for about 4 years now. It doesn't cost any money. This is unreasonable. It doesn't, affect the quality of the educator workforce. We can allow these non-citizens, many of whom are dreamers who have been in the country for most of their lives, have already attended public schools in Pennsylvania for K-12 and oftentimes college, and want to teach, and were previously having to move to New Jersey or Ohio in order to become teachers. And so we're really excited about this provision that made it across the finish line in this year's school code. Okay, so spotlight on Philadelphia. As I mentioned, we are experiencing the teacher shortage crisis more severely than any other district or county in Pennsylvania. The estimate is that we need over 2,000 additional qualified teachers just in Philadelphia right now. And so these investments in student teacher stipends will be critical for Philadelphia in helping us to attract more future teachers into our classrooms who will hopefully continue to stay. So our overall assessment of the budget, and this quote comes from an op-ed that I published in the Lancaster newspaper shortly after the budget was passed. It said the needs are great and our students deserve much more than the current system is providing them to prepare them for the big multifaceted futures they dream of. Viewed from this vantage point, the 2024 to 25 state budget has some bright spots for kids, but falls short of meeting the moment and fundamentally resetting the trajectory of our education system and student opportunity in Pennsylvania. Despite some positive steps, our state leaders must do more in terms of both dollars and policy to advance student opportunity and economic prosperity in the Commonwealth. Oops, sorry, I'm going to drop that link in the chat if you want to read the whole thing. But we know there's so much more to do, so what's next? Let's think about how you can be aware of the process for the next state budget and potentially get involved. In terms of school funding, advocates are going to be pushing for a larger investment in adequacy in next year's budget. Remember, we have about $4 billion left of the $4.5 billion adequacy gap still to close. Nothing's official yet, but thinking about how can we set a goal of closing that full gap in maybe 4 years, 5 years, a shorter time period so that students get what they need faster. We also really want to make sure that state leaders have a plan and a timeline for closing the gap. So one way that you can help is by contacting Governor Shapiro. and your state senator and representative, and tell them that it's a priority for you as a parent or as a taxpayer or as a citizen or as a teacher, that they commit to continuing to close the $4 billion adequacy gap in a reasonable amount of time. That is really helpful for them to hear from you this fall and then throughout next spring as the budget negotiations happen. But this time right now in the fall is when Governor Shapiro is deciding what he's going to propose in next year's budget. So now is a time that not many people are engaging in advocacy, but it can be very helpful for the governor to hear, oh, wow, people in Pennsylvania really still care about this school funding issue. They don't consider the job to be finished, and they're expecting me to finish the job. On early literacy, advocates are going to be pushing for Governor Shapiro to include $100 million for early literacy in his 2025 budget proposal to fund the policies that are laid out in Senate Bill 801. So we are really trying to help the governor see this opportunity to become a champion around early literacy. I will drop into the chat 2 links in just a second. The first one is a sign-on letter for organizations. If you are the leader of an organization or a part of an organization that would have the ability to potentially sign on to this letter, this is a letter that will be sent to the governor encouraging him to support this budget ask. We have about 15 orgs signed on so far. The deadline is Friday to sign on. And again, only if you are in a position where you can speak on behalf of your organization should you fill this out. We do also have a link that's for individuals to email Governor Shapiro and their state legislators. And so I would need to find that link, but I will put it into the chat before our time together is over. So if you are not in charge of an organization, but you still want to make your voice heard, we have a way for you to engage in that way as well. And as I mentioned, we will be launching an early literacy coalition soon with lots of ways for both organizations and individuals to be alongside us in this advocacy at the state level. I promise I'm getting to the end and we're almost ready for questions. Oh, thank you, Abby. Yes, I am sure that what you put in, if it's the one that I emailed you yesterday, is the one for individuals. So in terms of the educator workforce, Teach Plus is pushing for a large investment, around $80 million in the educator workforce in next year's budget. That would cover fully funding student teacher stipends, continuing to advocate for these grow your own teacher apprenticeship programs that I mentioned, as well as some pilots around advanced teaching roles. How can we retain teachers by creating pathways for them to advance in their roles and improving data so we can continue to better understand the problem. If you're really interested in these things, which we could do a whole webinar on all of these different ideas, I encourage you to join our existing PA Needs Teachers Coalition, which is a coalition that Teach Plus leads that is specifically focused on the educator workforce and addressing teacher shortages. And then finally, if you are an educator, again, pre-service, current, retired, former Pennsylvania educator, we would love to have you join our Teach Plus Pennsylvania Teacher Network. We oftentimes have virtual events similar to this where we share information. We are having an event in just on Monday with 2 Philadelphia legislators who are coming to speak to our teachers to share a bill that they're working on and get feedback from teachers on this bill that's actually in the General Assembly right now. So it's a great way if you're interested, if this kind is how you like to spend your time. I think you'll find lots of other opportunities and events through the PA Teacher Network. So in closing, I want to go back to the op-ed that I shared before, just with a note of hope and a call to action. Ultimately, while incremental progress was made this year, it's clear that there is not yet the political will in Harrisburg to prioritize the needs of students through the kinds of transformative, comprehensive investments and policy changes that will truly move the needle on student opportunities and outcomes. At a time when many in Harrisburg claim we can't do any more than what we're currently doing, we know much more is both possible and necessary. Our children, mine, Malik's, in the op-ed, I changed Calvin's name for the sake of anonymity, but talking about the same student I referenced earlier, and millions of others across Pennsylvania deserve nothing less. So with that, I will stop sharing and would love to answer any questions that you have about all of the information that I shared just now.
Thank you so much, Laura. This was a lot of information for us to chew on. I'm just going to review the chat, and we did have a question. Is there going to be anyone from the Pittsburgh Southwest area who is on the Early Literacy Coalition?
We would love to have folks from Pittsburgh and Southwestern PA in the Early Literacy Coalition. And I think I had seen that that was from Anna Kay. We will
Yeah.
absolutely be reaching out to you. You are on my list. We would specifically
Fantastic.
love to have the United Ways involved. I know that the United Ways are getting involved around early literacy in general. And I saw the news about the work with the Clinton Foundation that was announced. So absolutely, yes.
I'm sure that is great. That is not United Way of Southwestern Pennsylvania. So I just want to be clear.
Okay, that's good to know. I know that
That's
was
not
sort of
us. So
okay,
yeah, I'm
great. Well,
sure.
then
I'm
we would
sure
love
that
to have
there's,
you in this
but
coalition.
just full transparency. I don't want anybody to think I'm working with the Clinton Foundation if I'm not. So,
Okay.
but no, we would love to talk. I'd love to talk to you more about that. And Maria and I are already going to exchange some emails to chat a little bit more about it. And we have lots of connections to other early literacy organizations here. Then, and we can kind of talk about, what might be possible. So, thanks.
That would be great. Making a note. Thanks, Anakin.
Great. The next question was, does this student teacher stipend program extend to pre-K teachers too, or only K-12?
Yes, it does. It actually, as it was originally conceived, did not. And there was an adjustment to the legislative language that was made in this year's school code to extend it to also include pre-K teachers.
And why do you think legislators were so reluctant to include the multi-year commitment to school funding? What are the changes for that to pass this year?
The honest reason that they are reluctant to do it is because if they actually do commit themselves to spending this amount of money over the next 7 or so years, there is a good likelihood that we would need to raise taxes. There is not, in terms of, we have a current surplus of many $billion, but the pathway that we've been on in the past few years in terms of state spending is we are gradually spending down that surplus and spending down more as we increase investments in education. And so no politician wants to talk about tax increases, whether they're a Republican or a Democrat. And so part of it, I think, is having the honest conversation about the fact that if we are truly committed to our students' educational futures, that might mean needing to think about how are we going to raise some additional revenue to pay for it. But that's the honest answer, I think, is that if they actually made that commitment and put it down on paper, they would have to include it in their multi-year budget projections, and you would start to see within about 3 to 4 years that we would be starting to head towards a structural deficit.
Might you happen to know why PA did not receive the CLSD grant funding this year from the U.S. Department of Ed?
I do not know. I am curious whether the Department of Ed the State Department of Ed even applied. I will say that I think as we think about political will and leadership alignment, there's a lot of work that's needed with the Pennsylvania Department of Education to get them to really think bigger about their role in advancing the science of reading. So I did see that and was disappointed to see that, but also not really surprised. So again, we are in this case leaving money on the table that we could be getting from the federal government if we were being more proactive as a state. And so I have a number of goals on the administrative side to try to really encourage the Pennsylvania Department of Education to think about some of this federal funding, to also think about some of these communities of practice through the CCSSO runs a community of practice with a bunch of states around high quality instructional materials that our state leaders have shown no interest in engaging in. So there's a lot of work to be done, hence the coalition.
Do you have any thoughts or predictions on the impact of the November 2024 elections, specifically for the PA General Assembly, as it relates to the initiatives in school funding, early literacy, and educator workforce?
Well, I can tell you that it will be monumentally important what happens in the elections. I am not going to prognosticate what will happen, but I can tell you that if, for example, the Pennsylvania House, which is currently held by Democrats by a 1-seat majority, if that flips, that will be a very different reality in Harrisburg than the current reality where we have a divided government, Democratic House, Republican Senate. Likewise, I think it is not very likely, but not outside the realm of possibility that the state Senate could flip from Republican to Democrat, and to have a Democratic trifecta. I think you would again have a very different political reality. So it's extremely, everything depends on what happens in Pennsylvania in terms of who's in leadership. They're going to be going into a new session year next year, which means that regardless of whether the chambers flip in terms of control, there will be new elections for who's in leadership in each caucus. And that determines who's in charge of different committees. And, you know, with this particular literacy bill, there were committee chairs who were very specific barriers to progression of the bills. And so it certainly will have an impact, but I cannot tell the future. So I am not going to say exactly how, but definitely go out and vote for the candidates who you see as aligned with public education.
How do you join the coalition and attend the upcoming events?
The PA Needs Teachers Coalition, if you go to paneedsteachers.com/join us, which I put into the chat, you can go ahead and fill out a form and be added to our list and become a coalition member. If you are interested in the Literacy Coalition that we are still in the process of forming, I would, if you share your information with me, I can definitely make sure you get on the list, but we will definitely be communicating that out through Read by 4th as we get to a point of, we're aiming to have sort of a public launch and probably some sort of a public summit in early 2025 to kick off the coalition and invite formal membership into the coalition. So stay tuned, or if you want to reach out to me and say, put me on the list, we will make sure that you're on the list for later.
And then we have a plug for an event happening later today. Actually, Drexel's hosting the Science of Reading Day. So for folks, there is a link in there. Laura, I don't know if you're planning on attending.
I can't be there, but 2 other folks from Teach Plus will be there, and they will have handouts with the QR codes for these different advocacy calls to action around early literacy. And I wish I could be 2 places at once, but I have to do another presentation tonight.
Is the event with state officials open to attend?
I'm not sure which event in particular you're thinking about with state officials. When we launched the Early Literacy Coalition, I would anticipate that, you know, summit that we hold will include state officials there, and we will probably also be including opportunities to go to the Capitol and meet with state officials. Something coming up on Monday. Oh, sorry. Yes, that's the thing with the Pennsylvania Teacher Network. Yeah, let me find the registration link for the event. That's with Senator Jimmy Dillon and Representative Anthony Bellman. I can find that registration link and drop that into the chat. Thank you for reminding me, since I clearly forgot that quickly.
For the early literacy work / coalition, does it focus only on school-based literacy education support and or also support opportunities for younger kiddos such as 0 to 5?
I would say that is going to be something that the coalition helps to determine. Obviously, we all understand the connection between those birth to 5 years and the later success in reading by 3rd and 4th grade. So I think that there is absolutely room, while recognizing just on the political front, you can never take on too many priorities all at the same time. I think we definitely are open and would want those who are part of the coalition to help us to identify those specific policy goals and priorities. I think realistically in the upcoming year, we're most likely to be continuing to focus on getting this particular bill and investment across the finish line that has already been worked on for 1 to 2 years. But we would love to have the early childhood advocacy community be a part of that work and coalition. I think we all recognize there's more space for alignment in our approach around early literacy between ECE to K to 12.
All right, I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat. If I did miss your question, feel free to come off mute and ask it. I'm just rescanning to make sure that
I'm dropping into the chat the registration link for the event on September 30th. I will say it's intended, this specific event is intended primarily for current teachers because we are hoping that the legislators can hear from those in the classroom about this particular bill.
Perfect. Then one more question came in. When is the letter being sent tomorrow?
It won't be sent until next week. Anytime you can fill it out is great. And honestly, over the weekend is okay as well.
Okay. I think that is all the questions. Just to recap, I'm going to be sending out, we've seen lots of links in the chat. I'm going to be sending out a follow-up email to everyone who has registered for this event, so that everyone who was interested can get this information as well. And this recorded session will also be posted. So if you or any of your colleagues wanted to rewatch this session or watch it for the first time, if you want to share it out, feel free to do that as well. There are lots of thank yous coming in the chat, Laura. Hope you're seeing them. Thank you so much. And we have some applauses going on as well. We really appreciated your transparency and all the information that you shared. Thank you, everyone. We appreciate your time.